Mr. Gibbons, the floor is yours, sir, for 20 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this opportunity, and I do want to welcome our witnesses this morning, Mr. Watson and Mr. Black. Thank you for being here before this committee to enlighten us, and also thank you for your service to our country. Not often, I'm sure, do you hear people tell you thank you enough for what you do and the commitment that you've got. I want to say at the outset of this hearing that I believe that your experience, your dedication, and the time you've spent in the jobs that you've held, both in CIA and the FBI in counterterrorism, have made you the proper witnesses to be here. I think your knowledge level and experience bring what we need to hear on this committee, and we look forward to that. But let me say that the purpose of this hearing and the purpose of my questioning is to identify the systemic problems at the foundation of our intelligence community. This is not a finger-pointing exercise, and this certainly is not a witch hunt. This problem is larger than any one individual, and it's what we're out to do, is to find solutions to making sure that tomorrow's attacks and tomorrow's problems are solved today. And the issue before us is whether we had not just the right people or the number of people, but whether we had the right skill sets and whether we had the right operational attitude in some of our agencies to allow us to get to the critical information that would be necessary to fight this. And may I say to both of you that if I do probe or ask a question that requires a consideration of national security for clearance, please note the question, and we will be happy to receive your answer in the closed session that we have this afternoon. Mr. Black, I would like to start with you, if I may, and again, welcome to our committee. And let me say that you've always been a staunch advocate before our committee. This is my 6th year on the Intelligence Committee, and I can say to those watching that you have come before our committee time and time again as a staunch reporter of terrorist activities, what this country was facing, what we needed to do. My question would be, was there an articulation of your interest in the terrorist activity and the needs of our agencies dealing with terrorism communicated to superiors, and how was that received?
Well, my superiors, of course, are the Director of Operations, Jim Pavitt, and the Director of Central Intelligence, George Tenet. I would tell you, sir, that there is one person who has been more frenetic in his actions and more concerned about counterterrorism than I. That's the Director of Central Intelligence. My leadership certainly understood the threat. They were consumed with it. They were fixated on it. They attempted to allocate resources. As I recall from my statement, I did say that we were the first among equals, the entity not to be cut. I think that from a very small resource pie, we certainly got our share and a bit more. I think the concern was that this is a long war. My director declared the intelligence war in 1998. Took him very seriously. We hire people against it. We train for it. But I think the issue before you for your consideration would be, this is going to be a long struggle. And it's certainly going to see a lot of us out in terms of longevity. We need to build a base so that we can move forward without people like Mr. Watson's special agents getting burned out, or our personnel running on empty year after year. This is no way to run a system, sir. If you're going to fight, you want to get the right number of troops. And so more is not necessarily the only answer, but certainly more is required. But I think we also have to look for the resource base, to move forward. Thank you.
So what you're telling our committee is that your advocacy of the threat posed by the terrorist was communicated to your leadership in a need for more resources in the application of the war against terrorism beginning in 1998.
I actually came to this job in 1999. But
Beginning in
but the answer to that is yes, they're certainly aware of my concerns. They are as equally concerned, and being by their side, their actions conform to their concerns.
Now, you also mentioned that budget reductions in 1999 saw or forced an approximate 30% cut in agency operations. This is in opposition to what we're hearing in terms of the rise in the advocacy of the threat. Can you explain why administrative cuts were requested to the agency when there was an increase in the level of threat knowledge?
Well, I'm only going to speak for the Counterterrorism Center, but I will tell you is that the Counterterrorism Center essentially was able to perform at the level, or was resourced at the level, that we achieved as a result of supplemental funding. The one-year monies, I thought, were, in terms of the mission, again, as I stated in my testimony, was relatively modest. That appeared to be how we conduct affairs in the government. We are the recipients of this type of action, sir.
Let me go back to something you indicated, that during your time as the head of the CTC, chief of the DCI portion for CTC, personnel numbers. Oftentimes we hear that you had equivalent of 3 infantry companies or on the line fighting this war. My question to you is, did the numbers of people you had have the right excuse me, the right skill mix with regard to language capability, with regard to operational capability and skills needed to be able to gather the appropriate information?
I think that we had a very good skill mix. We hire towards this. We emphasize those attributes that are going to be effective overseas. That's what we do.
Well, let me ask the question then. Did you have the right numbers of people that could speak Arabic, Pashto, or Urdu, Farsi?
You always need more speakers in those languages. We have gone out of our way increasingly over the time to specifically target these types of individuals with these language skills. In fact, I can tell you that the Counterterrorism Center even advanced through the appropriate offices its own hiring campaign, where we advertise in newspapers specifically looking for people interested in counterterrorism and that had the right language qualifications.
Okay. Many times in our intelligence gathering overseas, we often use liaison type operations. When is it essential to use liaison operations, and when is it, or when should we use efforts for unilateral type operations?
I appreciate that question. That's a very important one. This is a global war, and we are involved in essentially intelligence combat. When you go to war, it's usually a good idea to have as many allies on your side as you can. There's a commonality of interest here. Most countries are against terrorism, and we in the CIA have developed a constellation of allies that certainly, as I speak right now, is extremely effective. When you need to do it yourself is when there is no friend to help you, there is no alternative besides taking high-risk actions on your own. I must say we conduct the normal business of intelligence operations at all times, but counterterrorism is a little special in that we all need to cooperate, and we do. But there's no reluctance to, as you say, unilateral operations. This is what I do for a living, and there's no hesitation, and certainly on the leadership of this director, we launch very quickly whenever it's appropriate. Do
you feel there was an under-reliance on unilateral operations between the periods of 1999 and 2001?
No, I do not. I believe that with the resource base that we had, that we maximized our operational product with exactly how we did it, which was a good mix, an appropriate mix at the right time.
So you don't believe that we could have used more unilateral operations in that time period?
Well, we could, absolutely. We need the people to do them.
So the issue was, then we go back to, if you had the people with the right skill mix to gather that information and to do those operations.
Yes, sir. If you had the right number of people with the right skill mix.
Well, that's the issue.
Yes, sir.
That's
There you go.
That's the bottom foundation issues. No matter how many people we have, we've got to have the right skill mix, whether it's language skills. And I'll ask you again, and you feel that we had the right number of language skilled people to conduct the right kind of operations in a war against terrorism?
We always need more. My opening testimony stated that we need additional personnel to be as effective as possible overseas.
So I guess the answer is no, we didn't have the right numbers of language skilled people. We needed more.
Yes, correct.
Okay. The Mr. Watson, I want to turn a question to you in the time I have. Do you feel that the FBI was overly focused on gathering information for prosecution purposes rather than focusing on terrorism prevention prior to 2001?
I think, as I've indicated, in 1998, that the light really came on for me personally as well as an organization, that we were going to be involved in collection of evidence, we were going to be involved in investigating post-events. But we also realized in 1998 the need to be proactive. And there's a blending of that. And that's a cultural change within the FBI. And in order to figure that out, that's why it was so important to be able to evaluate and have an understanding of exactly where you were. So the answer to your question is 1998, starting in 98, and this was a very difficult process because of what we had always done. And then you try to talk to individuals or even outside the Bureau about, well, what do we think might happen across the horizon? And you look at the cyber arena, and I'm trying to answer your question very specifically. We looked at that in 98 because NIPC, the National Infrastructure Protection Center, was under the counterterrorism program at the time. What in the world are we going to do to try to get to where we need to be by 05 in just the cyber arena? And people started thinking about it, and I started thinking about it, that if we don't do it, we'll be here in 05 and we won't be able to figure out cyber issues, and there will probably no crime or no criminal act committed that doesn't involve cyber. So to answer your question, heavy on the collection of evidence and investigative side. But starting in 98, it was very clear to me that you had to have a vision and you had to look beyond cases. And if we were just running out and investigating cases, that's all we would ever be doing. And so some smart people got together and we decided what is the threat and how do we address it.
Let me ask both of you to answer this question because I think it's clear that both of you have definite and distinct approaches to counterterrorism in America. Would ask each of you to identify how you measure success in your fields with regard to what you've done since 1999 or 98, whenever you came to those. What are your success measurements and benchmarks that you established to allow you to identify whether you were what you were doing was correct?
I'll go first, show me. Who?
Mr. Watson, if you want to go
Okay.
first, that's fine.
That is a very fair question, and I'll be happy to answer that. I think in order to evaluate the counterterrorism program of the FBI, and if you look at prior to 98 and even post 98, you had to have very specific criteria. And if you rely upon the number of arrests, number of convictions, or the number of acts of terrorism prevented, I think you might get a faulty representation of how well you're doing. And so the idea was, starting in 1998, was to see how well and at what criteria. So we developed specific criteria to measure and evaluate ourselves at the field, at every field office. And it was no longer acceptable for a special agent in charge to be assigned to some field office that had worked drugs all his life, who is now responsible for counterterrorism in a certain state or area. He needs help with that, or she needs help. So we developed specific, measurable criteria to say, this is what we want you to do in Little Rock, or whatever city it was. And we're going to measure that. And I'm going to hold you accountable for that action. And this is where, when you put all that together, is a huge management success to be able to say exactly where you were in the process and exactly what resources for the first time we needed and what were the technology problems. And does all our field offices have enough analysts? And you measure that. And we measured that through a series of reports every 6 months provided to the director. Did that answer your specific question?
Yes, Mr. Black.
Sir, essentially, in my business, you're looking at a global counterterrorism program. There are a lot of criteria of success or measurements towards success. There's things such as the number and the quality of foreign relationships that you have overseas, the number and quality of assets that are providing you insightful counterterrorist information. Also, the support and development measurements, the selection of appropriate officers, as you mentioned before, the language criteria, the training given, and assignment to specific regions to maximize the qualities and skills of that officer against specific targets. In the end, it is my personal view that programmatical approach is a good one in counterterrorism. Because this fight's going to be long, it's going to be very difficult. It's going to consume the time of a lot of our officers as well as resources, and you're looking at relationships, looking at your own people conducting these operations, as well as the product, which is the reporting from assets to be analyzed by analysts, and the end result objective, which is very difficult, but which we do achieve and we attempt to achieve always, is to develop that tactical, detailed intelligence so that can be passed over to law enforcement or other intelligence services so that we can preempt and disrupt specific attacks and save lives.
Carter, may I have just one other thought that I would like to, referring to your question. I think Senator Shelby and Congressman Goss are good examples. I'll use both of you in this. I mean, when I would come up and appear before you, I think the question would be for the FBI, Mr. Watson, what's your budget? And the numbers were so and so. Well, last year, how many acts of terrorism did you prevent? What did we get with that money? And my mind would race real rapidly. We had the case in Sacramento. We had the guy down in Tampa, Florida. Well, if we cut your budget in half, would we get half that many? If we doubled your budget, would we get double the number of preventions? And the answer is no. The answer is you have to be working at the highest capability, the maximum things that the FBI could do. So the measurement is, how well are you doing on the capacity? And if you're there, then that's all you can do. But if you're not there, that's the measure standard in a counterterrorism program. It has not anything to do, well, it does, and I don't want to downgrade that, by a specific number of statistics. And we've long been driven by statistics. It's being able to project, and it's being able to understand what your capacities are. And we were hurting. We were hurting in the areas of training and analyst, those things. I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you. Mr. Black, I want to go back to something you indicated. The product of your measurement was reporting, increased reporting as part of that product. It seems to me that there was a dramatic rise in the number of reports that were presented to the agency from the field with regard to terrorism over this period of time. My question is, do you feel that the threshold of reporting was low enough or so low that it presented you with a flood of information that could not be properly analyzed, it could not be properly disseminated to the intelligence community, that would have been able to be verified and substantiated and corroborated because of the sort of frantic pace that we were under to get information and any information that we could. Did that have that effect? In other words, preventing it from being properly analyzed, properly disseminated, and distributed to our intelligence community?
We're obviously in the business of collecting intelligence and disseminating intelligence. When we collect intelligence information that is new and it's considered at the time to be accurate, then that is passed along with the appropriate review and processing, and that would go to our analysts. I seem to always return or come back to the same thing, and that is that the people are the most important part of all of this. All the intelligence we collect is reviewed and processed. It is disseminated. We're not going to be in the business of withholding intelligence information from a validated customer. And there's a lot of secrecy involved in this. But if it is caveated, if we don't essentially think it's necessarily completely true, we may say that.
Mr. Chairman, I see that my time has expired. I want to thank you for the